have a question here about diet. Scott, maybe you can talk about this. You know, eating carbohydrates often feeds a sugar addiction. And Dagmar saying, since stopping eating certain food, I feel my mind is much calmer and I'm much better at reflection and inquiry. Is that something that you've had experience of at the centre?
You know, I want to say that everybody's different. So back in November, I actually restricted my diet mostly to very low carbs and low sugars, and I saw a very positive benefit from that. And I'll still have one day where, or maybe it's a day and a half sometimes, when I'll eat some of that stuff. But for the most part, it's been reduced and definitely helpful. So you could say it's mostly abstinence around that stuff, mostly, but not all. But I want to leave it to the individual, because we've seen people come here and they absolutely need to get distance from food in order, like Lisa said, to deal with what's left when I take the food away. What are the traumas and the stuff that I'm not dealing with? And then for other people, it's that they have to dabble a little bit in it because it brings up the shame and it brings up the trauma. And then if they're in a supportive environment, they can look at it. So again, there's no recipe. I just try to take it as it comes. You have a little bit more freedom with food and sex addiction to kind of not stick to a pure abstinence model. Whereas we can't do that really. It's very difficult to do that with drugs and alcohol because we're regulated by the state of California. We have to be careful with things like that.
I'd like to chime in on this one, having for the last maybe 20 weeks been following a very prescribed eating plan to see if I could take myself off completely sugar and flour. And the one thing that was remarkable in the first about 10 weeks was that my cravings, in the first couple weeks, my cravings, the ones that I thought were purely from emotional issues, went away, I'd say at least 80 to 90%. So what Scott was describing is kind of what I was left with was, okay, so then what are the other things that are going on when those cravings do come up? And there was definitely shame and embarrassment. And I've been looking at that myself and with my husband, who's wonderful at asking me inquiry kinds of questions around the times when my cravings do arise. And also looking for approval. So it did, in my case, help me to distance myself from those foods for a while and let my body clean out somewhat, I guess. So now I am playing around with giving into a craving and exploring what comes up when I do eat this or drink that. Diet Coke was one of my issues, and seeing what else is there to explore. So it can be really helpful if you have a container to do it in, to explore it and not just purely abstain if it's not a life-threatening situation for you.
Thanks, Melanie. Does anybody else have anything to share on the food issue?
Yeah, I'd like to say something. And I think I mentioned it a couple of days ago during the marketing meeting. When I came off drugs and alcohol, I hadn't a clue about the other countless addictions that were floating around and with me, really until I started using the inquiries, and the gap between when I first stopped using drugs and alcohol till I started training in the inquiries was maybe 6 years or something. So it has really turned into in a way, it's, for me personally, it started to become a bit exciting. And I don't mean to minimize anything else that somebody might be going through. And carbohydrates would have been one of the things that that I would have been looking at. And this was mainly through the damage that I would have done to my gut while using drugs and alcohol. I started really taking care of what I was eating. And then for one day last weekend, there was some sensations happening, so I sat down to do a little bit of inquiry, and I realized that I hadn't eaten from early on that morning. And I said to myself, well, it's in the evening, and if I eat now, then I usually wake up the next morning with a sore stomach, so I won't do that. The next morning I woke up and I decided to not eat until midday, which would have made it about 24 hours. And there wasn't, it was kind of gentle. That process was kind of gentle. Then I had a melon, and when I had the melon, that's when the cravings really kicked in, which I was really surprised at. But and then on another level, it was pretty amazing for me to see the link between the addiction to food and the addiction to drugs and alcohol, because at times when I wasn't binging, when I was drinking and doing drugs, there were periods where the cravings weren't boiling as much until I went on a binge, and then everything erupted. And it reminded me a lot of that, only this time it was with food and something, in my personal experience, a lot less dangerous. And it really opened the door for me to actually, and that's where the excitement came from, because I was actually, it felt like a really safe environment to be able to look at that, when it had so much of a connection to the drug and alcohol addiction, which was a life or death situation, really. So that's what I'd like to share about that.
Thanks, Colin.